If someone were to ask you right now why you're a Christian, would you be ready to give a good answer? 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. We all can have different reasons for believing in Jesus. Some might believe in him because they were raised that way. Maybe you witnessed some kind of personal miracle that happened in your life or the life of a loved one that convinced you Jesus is Lord. Maybe you've done your own research and reached your own conclusions that Jesus is indeed the way, the truth, and the life. Whatever your reason is, would you be ready to explain it to someone and back up your faith if you were asked right now? In my case, I was raised Christian, but I fell away from the faith due to lust and homosexual temptations. But because of trauma I suffered from people who I thought were my friends, I lost faith in the furry fandom and the world and eventually started to research faith in God. Was the trauma the reason why I believe in God? Do I need some kind of escapism or some kind of made-up purpose? No. This process took years, and despite the betrayals, I was actually doing really well for myself, thank God, but it all started to feel so pointless. I worked just to survive and to support my family. I tried to find purpose in health, exercise, and financial stability, but also in deep lust and homosexual practice. As I researched more wellness topics, though, they kept leading to the Bible and Christianity. I kept skipping the Christian themes, but they kept coming back, so eventually I started listening. I started praying again. I started reading my Bible again. It didn't seem like a big deal when it told me to avoid easy sins like no murder or stealing, etc., but eventually it became undeniable that homosexual practice is sin, and that was the pivotal issue that really put my faith to the test. I don't believe I was a true Christian until I took the next step, because now I started to question my belief in Jesus. I didn't want to accept him if it meant abandoning my identity as a gay furry, but if Jesus really is the Son of God, then I don't want to go to hell. So I had to research Jesus Christ to see if history really backed what he said and did. I wasn't going to abandon my lust and homosexual practice just because a thousands of years old book told me to. Well, the thing is, history does back up what Jesus said and did. Historians pretty much universally agree that Jesus existed, was crucified on the cross, and that his tomb was empty 3 days later. Even the chief priests who hated Jesus and wanted him crucified had to admit that the body was missing. They just blamed the disciples for stealing the body, even though the tomb was sealed with a large stone and had guards outside. But if the disciples supposedly knew this was all a lie, why would they all be willing to be tortured in horrific ways, along with all but one of them being martyred for their faith in Jesus Christ? They wouldn't die for something they knew was a lie. They did this because they themselves saw the resurrected Jesus with their own eyes. In fact, Jesus appeared to over 500 people in his resurrected glorified body before ascending into heaven. Not only that, but on Pentecost he sent the Holy Spirit upon the apostles and early church, which is why so many of them were willing to suffer and die for this very new religion. Why would the early church be willing to suffer like this unless they really had witnessed the power of the resurrected Jesus, whether directly or indirectly? And what about Saul, who persecuted Christians, but then Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and then he ultimately repented as Paul and preached the gospel in many different places, as well as wrote books of the Bible? What about James, the human brother of Jesus, who didn't believe in him but later repented and wrote a book of the Bible as well? Non-biblical sources back up the Bible on so many things that happened in Jesus' life and afterwards. Even the Jewish Talmud had to admit that Jesus did miracles, but they credited it to sorcery instead of the power of God. And it is proven that the Bible of that day is reliably preserved to now. Not only do we have books of the Old Testament that predate Jesus' birth thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but even the New Testament has been incredibly preserved across the last 2,000 years. Yes, there are many variations, but the massively significant, overwhelming majority of these are spelling, grammar, or rearrangement differences that do not change the meaning of the writing at all. The extremely tiny minority that do slightly change the meaning do not affect essential Christian doctrine whatsoever. Dr. Daniel Wallace explains 2 examples, like some demons being cast out with prayer or with prayer and fasting, or the mark of the beast number potentially being 616 instead of 666. Ultimately, it became clear to me that Christianity and the Bible we have today are true, so I repented of my homosexual practice and lust, and now I use my platform to spread the gospel to others so more can be saved. God bless you.